We are back live from the CBB Central podcast. It was supposed to be a special guest week on the show. We had a great guest lined up. Unfortunately, some technical difficulties came up. So we're hoping to have him on next week. We'll keep that name quiet until it's all confirmed. But I think you guys will be really excited to hear what our hopeful guest next week has to say. We decided we'd still record a podcast, still put together one of these two deep dive podcasts, Brad, and we've got Notre Dame and George Mason on the docket today.
Very excited for both teams. The first four teams that we analyzed earlier in this podcast. They're seen more as more sure things in terms of the tournament. I know opinions on St. John's vary greatly, but LSU, Michigan State, Oregon, those are teams that most people have in their top 25s, or in some cases even their top 20 or top 15. But today we're going to take a look at a couple of teams that most people have on the bubble. Opinions on these teams vary greatly based on last season and who they're losing and bringing back. But I'm very excited to dive into this.
So let's dive in on Notre Dame to start it off. Notre Dame had a fairly surprising season last season in a negative way, mostly just due to injuries. Bonzie Colson wasn't healthy. Matt Farrell wasn't healthy. And as a result, the Fighting Irish did just miss the NCAA tournament, but did go 21-15, 8-10 in the ACC. That was good for 10th. Temple Gibbs led them in scoring. He'll return as a junior and be, I think, one of the better players in the ACC. Actually, he did not lead their team in scoring, but he was the most available player, if you will, because Colson missed 10 games and Farrell missed 5. For guys who kind of played the whole season, Gibbs was the number one guy. But Farrell averaged 16 points, 5.5 assists. He's gone. Bonzie Colson, 20-10 when he was healthy. He's gone as well as 11 points and 8 rebounds from Martinez Gebben, who I think was the most slept on 11 and 8 in 25 minutes a game player in the country. Like, I didn't even realize he was that good last season. So 3 significant losses across the board for Notre Dame from a team that was probably on track to be an NCAA tournament team for injuries, but didn't really pan out.
Yeah, I think especially because they only had 3 guys who played in all 36 games. It was Gibbs, Gibbon, and then John Mooney, who really stepped into a bigger role as a sophomore. In terms of Gibbon, he's someone who really caught my eye during the World University Games, where Purdue participated last summer. Gibbon was on, I think, the Lithuanian team, and he played really well for them. He was someone who played a little bit his first 3 seasons, but really broke out as a senior and was a pretty huge part of this team with all the moving pieces, to play in every game and average what he averaged. And then it was very interesting and very surprising to me that Notre Dame was the first team to not make the NCAA tournament. They were, according to the selection committee after the selection show, they were the last team out that was bumped when who was it? Davidson won the Atlantic 10. So certainly a very unexpected and roller coaster season for the Fighting Irish.
Right, and this is a team that at one point was in the top 5 after winning out in Maui, and then just everything fell apart in terms of health. And I mean, that's not to say that this team was going to be a top 5, even top 25 team had Bonzie Colson and Matt Farrell been healthy all season. Because after that incredible run in Maui, they did get blown out by Michigan State. Then they lost on a neutral to Indiana. They lost by 3 to Ball State at home. And that was kind of the end of their full health, because into ACC play, they had that long losing streak where they lost to Georgia Tech, North Carolina, Louisville, Clemson, Virginia Tech, and Duke, all by less than 10 points, except for that Duke loss. And then they also lost to North Carolina State by 18 before turning it around and finishing fairly strong with 5 wins in their final 8 regular season games before stealing 2 in the ACC tournament and making things at least interesting for the selection committee. I think they were not as deserving of an NCAA tournament bid as some people suggested. I didn't think that them missing the tournament was a travesty by any means. I thought it was deserving that they missed the tournament. But overall, it's still kind of a what could have been story, especially given they had a star like Bonzi Colson, who is a legit All-American when healthy.
Yeah, and I think they performed exceptionally well without Farrell and Colson. I know that they had that extended losing streak, but I mean, the teams that they lost to were all very, very accomplished teams. I think Georgia Tech on the road was the only team in that extended losing streak to not make the NCAA tournament. Oh, and Louisville too. But I mean, losing to Duke on the road, UNC by 1 point at home. I mean, it's not a total sky is falling scenario. And the whole basis behind this Notre Dame should be included in the field argument was now they're at full strength with Colson and Farrell back. But I mean, we mentioned earlier that they did lose at home to Ball State with a fully healthy roster and to Indiana on a neutral. So that argument, definitely had some holes. I've seen a lot of people with Notre Dame in that 9 to 12 range of the ACC, which I think is appropriate. But the guys who are kind of thrust into a larger role with those injuries last year, now that they have this full season under their belt and can enter the season with a more defined role, I think that's going to pay huge dividends for Notre Dame, why they could potentially be better than the remnants of last year's roster indicate.
Yeah, so let's get into this year's roster and specifically the newcomers that are coming into the fold. It's as good a recruiting class as we've seen from a Notre Dame team under Mike Brey. There is 4 top 100 players in this class, as well as a high-level recruit coming in as a transfer, and then kind of a more typical Notre Dame commit, a 3-star fringe top 300 prospect. Let's start with the transfer, Juwan Durham, a former elite recruit out of Tampa, Florida, went to UConn and couldn't get any run there as a freshman, and then transferred over to Notre Dame. He's a guy who I'm really excited to watch after a year of development. Then they have 4 commits in the top 100, as I said. Nate Lazuski, who's kind of a stretch 4, number 63 in the composite 24/7 rankings out of a really good prep program, Northfield Mount Herman in Massachusetts. Robbie Carmody, a competitive shooting guard who can really put the ball in the basket out of Pennsylvania, number 82. Numbers 83 in the 24/7. Prentice Hubb, a 6'2" combo guard out of Gonzaga Prep in DC, who I'm really high on as an immediate impact guy. And then Dane Goodwin from Columbus, Ohio, who's a number 97 in the composite, a very good shooter at 6'4", as well as Chris Doherty, who's a kind of an undersized 4-man who brings a ton of energy and toughness in the front court. A guy who was looked at as a mid-major prospect for much of his recruitment, and then kind of snuck into the high major ranks with Rutgers offer, and then Notre Dame sneaking in as well. So he's more of a developmental piece who's going to, I think, have to shoot it a little bit if he's going to play a significant role in the ACC. But Mike Brey's been known to take a chance on these hardworking guys, and Doherty certainly fits that mold.
Yeah, I think the major theme to this recruiting class is shooting. I mean, Hubb, Carmody, Goodwin, and Nate Lazuski are some of the best shooters in the class, especially Lazuski, who's going to provide a lot of floor spacing and is probably the – actually, I would say Prentice Hubb is probably the guy who's most likely to get immediate playing time just because he's the second point guard and he could play alongside Temple Gibbs, give that backcourt some scoring pop. But Nate Lazuski should also challenge for playing time in the front court. Maybe he could even play with Mooney in a smaller lineup that really spaces the floor. But this Notre Dame team is set up really well for years to come. In terms of who they're bringing back, we mentioned Temple Gibbs, who's their best player, really took a step forward with Farrell and Colson out. We also mentioned John Mooney, who's probably their starting 4-man, and they also return a senior in Rex Fluger, who's kind of like a glue guy, ball mover, can play that two through three, maybe even the four. And then Elijah Burns and Nick Jogo could potentially see a bigger role this year. Burns is a pretty athletic big man who could see some time at center. Played a little more last year as a sophomore. And then Jogo, he's kind of like an athletic, kind of like a Chetty Osman type from the Cavs. Probably going to bolster that bench unit with some experience. And then lastly, DJ Harvey, who missed a lot of time. He missed almost half the season last year with injury, and injuries could be a problem again this year for him. According to what's been rumored, he's another multi-positional guy who can put the ball on the floor a little bit. He can score. He's an important piece for this Notre Dame team.
And Harvey's a former top 100 recruit who I was really looking forward to watching out of DeMatha. He's a guy who I think would have been projected to really take another step forward in this game, but he's having microfracture surgery this offseason. Mike Brey is hopeful that he will return for the start of the season, but it certainly takes away any of that development time that you really look for a freshman rising sophomore with Harvey. And so I think this really brings us to an interesting point of how does Notre Dame craft this rotation? And Mike Brey's really been about player development and guys, stepping into bigger roles from year to year, rather than just bringing in freshmen to kind of replace guys before they've even or recruit over them to a certain degree. But this year seems a little bit different with the amount of talent. How do you think Mike Brey balances this kind of returning bench unit, stepping into starting roles versus this high level recruiting class?
Yeah, so I think he's obviously very accustomed to having these freshmen play smaller roles, and then gradually, by the time that they're a junior or even a senior, they become like stars in the ACC. Guys like Steve Asturia, VJ Beecham, Matt Farrell barely played his first few seasons. But then there are also guys like Temple Gibbs, who I think played a pretty significant role as a freshman. I think it was like a sixth man, and like Bonzi Colson too came off the bench as a freshman. And gave some real meaningful contributions. I think the bench. I think Durham probably is the first player off the bench just because he can play the five. He's a total flyer. I mean, he had so many injuries in his high school and during his time at UConn. He can space the floor. He's very skilled. And that's something that Notre Dame could really use at that center spot. A nice contrast to Elijah Burns. So I think he's probably the most likely to receive big minutes off the bench. And then I think Prentice Hub will probably be in it as he's the only other point guard. Lozuski, and then to round it out, you have for that ninth spot, you either have a returner in Nick Jogo, or probably a guy who can really shoot the ball in either Robbie Carmody or Dane Goodwin. I think I'll go with Carmody for that ninth man.
You feel like either Carmody or Goodwin red shirts just because they are very similar players on paper. It would seem kind of redundant unless one kind of carves out a starting spot, which I don't really anticipate. It would seem a bit redundant for to be kind of sitting in that bench unit. It would seem like one's going to get playing time and one might not. As far as their starting unit, I think you have to assume that that Mooney starts, that Temple Gibbs starts, obviously, and that Rex Fluger starts. So I think that's three starters right there. And then from there, how do you build out this rotation? Mooney at 6'9", 245, but doesn't really protect the rim. He's more of that stretch big guy. Probably more like a 4. I think you could see Juwan Durham play next to him and start at the 5 right away, and have a lineup of maybe Gibbs, Fluger, Mooney, Durham, and then I could even see them start Prentice Hub right away and have two guards who can handle the ball in the backcourt. And then you have off your bench, you have Harvey, depending on his health. I think he's a starter if he's healthy. I just don't know that he'll be healthy right away. So I'll say he comes off the bench. Jogo off the bench in a rotation spot. And then obviously Burns gets some front court minutes along with Lazewski, and then a reserve guard in either Goodwin or Carmody.
Yeah, I think, trying to project like a more functional lineup, like we probably need to assume that Harvey's going to, if not miss the start of the season, at least miss some of the preparation, which, even though in terms of full potential and like full talent, like when healthy, he would be one of their best players and one of their obvious starters. I think you are correct that it could make more sense to start a guy like Prentice Hub and then move Pfluger down to that 3 spot where he doesn't have to do as much ball handling and creating himself. I could see Burns making one of these upperclassmen jumps that Notre Dame players usually make with their big men. I mean, they're probably the biggest example of a team where the first couple of years the bigs hardly play, and then all of a sudden it's just boom. The big man's in there. Maybe it's a game later in the season they're like a sophomore or a junior and they have a big game, and then that kind of propels their career going forward. I remember I think it was Tom Knight, was a former Notre Dame big. It was like a mid-conference game, and he just like went off, and then they had either a starting center or a valuable reserve from that point forward.
Right, and I don't know that Burns though is necessarily a 5, and that's kind of where it's interesting. Is Durham isn't necessarily a 5 either. They don't really have 5s on this roster, and they don't really have any true point guards. They have a lot of kind of they have combo guards who can score the ball, and they have lots of like versatile forwards who play the 4 more naturally and can step out and shoot it. And I'm really interested to see how that impacts not only their defense with a lack of potential rim protection, although Durham can provide some of that with just his length on the weak side. And then obviously looking at the point guards, how does the ball handling get split up? Rex Pfluger actually had averaged 3.2 assists per game last season when he got shifted more over to the 2 guard spot later in the season with the with Farrell's injury especially. He had the ball in his hands a fair amount, so he's a better passer than I think he gets credit for. And so now it's just kind of a situation of how do you balance this front court where you have Burns, who's more of an athletic 4 who rebounds the ball pretty well, versus maybe like a stretch guy like Lazewski. And you also have to balance, potential versus production. When you're Notre Dame, you're trying to win every year, but this is a year where they're developing these young players because everyone key other than Rex Pfluger should be back next season. Does that impact at all how much you rely on younger big men early in the process to let them develop a little bit of trial by fire? I know it's not necessarily typical Mike Bray, but it might be something that they look at for this season.
In terms of Pfluger, though, he's not really like he gets assists from like ball moving. Like he doesn't do a ton of creating on his own. He's more of just like like he's not gonna like break his man off the dribble and like create a shot for someone. Like he'll get assists, but it's more out of like the system. At least that's what I've seen from him in the times I've watched Notre Dame. And I don't necessarily know that Mike Bray cares too much about having a traditional center. I think if they can get that offensive advantage, like in 2016-17 when Colson was their primary 5, makes them such a dynamic offensive team and a team that other teams really have to adjust and account for, where they had like the 2 wings who could shoot, and Pfluger and Steve Asturia, and then they used VJ Beecham at that undersized 4, and then they had Colson at the 5. That was a very dynamic offensive lineup that really spaced you out and shot the ball exceptionally well.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good call, and it's going to be hard to really project this rotation too much until we kind of get those fall camp reports of who's looking at getting minutes, what guys are in that position to get those minutes. But I mean, overall, I think you have to like the direction that this program is going, and I think you have to like the direction with which they're recruiting for the future. They made the top 6 for Joe Girard. Now, they may not be the favorite for the top 100 shooter from Glens Falls, New York, but they're certainly in the mix. Isaiah Stewart's a target of theirs, who's a 5-star big man, who's from Rochester, New York, and playing at La Lumiere. They're recruiting a different level of player than we've seen in the past. I think that has to be a great sign for Notre Dame. Now the question, can they consistently finish the job with these guys, or do they fall into the kind of John Beilein trap? Does Mike Bray fall into the Beilein trap of, because you're more of a player development coach over 4 years, you struggle to get some of these higher level recruits?
Yeah, because I mean, neither Michigan nor Notre Dame is going to have any problems bringing in like 4-star guys. It's taking that next step in and adding in Isaiah Stewart or like one of these top 10 one and done or a 2 and done guy that could really bolster a veteran roster and inject some talent in there. And this is an exceptionally difficult rotation to try to figure out. But I mean, if it was an easy one, we would not have anything to talk about. So I'm okay with them trying to predict the top 9 end up looking wrong when Dane Goodwin's like the starting shooting guard or something in February. But and then in terms of these fall practice reports by like your John Rothstein and stuff, I came across something from last offseason where John Calipari in October said that the best player on their team was William Gabriel. So these practice reports can have some sort of like PR spin to them, or they could have another motivation, or they could just end up being flat out inaccurate. So it's always something to take with a grain of salt.
Yeah, that's definitely true, especially with Rothstein. I think the media, the coaches use Rothstein to get what they want out there. So I think Calipari wanted to kind of fuel to the fire his younger guys. And not only that, but kind of give him an excuse when the younger guys struggled early. I think he understood this was going to be a learning phase team, and he wanted to say, no, these guys aren't ready yet. Wendy Gabriel's our best player. And Wendy Gabriel was very good. He wasn't their best player. So you always have to kind of look and understand when you see a hot take like that, what it means. I always do prefer beat writers for the teams to get those types of practice reports than maybe a John Rothstein, just because the beat writers can provide a little bit more trust with a Mike Bray, and they understand, they have sources inside the team beyond just maybe the coach. So, but it's always interesting between that and then early season stuff, just to kind of get a read. And Notre Dame certainly will be a team I'm watching. So, Brad, what do we think of this Notre Dame team this season? Do we think it's an NCAA tournament team?
So I have them right outside the NCAA tournament as like a first 4 out or a second 4 out type of team. I have them, I think, not 9th in the ACC. I will check on that in 1 second, but just in terms of why I am putting them there, they have a excellent player in Temple Gibbs who is this leader, but they're kind of missing that secondary scorer. At least it's not quite apparent unless someone takes a major step forward that would be that you wouldn't necessarily predict. I think that they're just missing that top end talent to go along with Temple Gibbs. They have a very deep roster. They have 10, 11 guys who could potentially be a legitimate rotation piece. But I think there's just the overall talent level is a little lower than you would like, even with a team like Notre Dame, where guys usually take pretty significant steps forward as they get older. And yes, I do have them at number 9. A pretty huge jump, though, for me between number 8, Clemson, who I have as a borderline top 25, and then number 9, Notre Dame.
Yeah, I think they belong right in that 9 to 12 tier of teams who aren't clear NCAA tournament teams that could get in there, depending on how things kind of work out. I really want to say they're an NCAA tournament team because I like Mike Bray and I like these young guys. I I really think one of these freshmen winds up being an all ACC freshman team pick, which for Notre Dame feels like a bit of a hot take just because they typically don't get the minutes. But I feel like one of them will find an opportunity and take it, and I'm really excited to watch this team develop over the year. I think they'll be a much better team in March than November, and I think that's something you always bet on with Mike Gray, but especially with a young team like this. I do tend to agree with you. I don't think the talent's there to carry them through, especially early in the season, where they can build a true resume for an NCAA tournament run. I think they'll wind up just on the outside, but they'll be in that discussion all season long, and then certainly the future being bright. I mean, Gibbs is one of the best players in the ACC now, and he still has 2 years of eligibility left. I'm not saying he'll use both, but he's not necessarily a clear NBA prospect as kind of like a 6'3" 2 guard at this point, that he'll, be in a position to leave early for the draft. So we'll see what happens there with Gibbs, but he's a guy I can't wait to watch this season as one of the best players in the ACC and one of the best players in the country.
Yeah, so while I do agree that I think one of these freshmen really takes a step forward and becomes a focal point on this Notre Dame starting lineup. I mean, to make the all freshman team in the ACC, I mean, you're competing with R.J. Barrett, Cam Reddish, Jalen Horde, Naz Little, Kobe White. So I mean, that's some steep competition, which shows. I mean, if a Notre Dame player is to make that all freshman team, they had one hell of a season.
Yeah, I think it would have to be like Prentice Hub scoring like 11 points, 4 rebounds, 3 assists type of season, and then Notre Dame makes the tournament. I think that's like the season he'd need. But it wouldn't surprise me if he does that. I'm pretty high on Prentice Hub, and so we'll see what happens there. But I think this is a pretty interesting team to monitor as the season transpires, and they're a team that I'm really glad we did this preview, even though I didn't feel like we came out with any. I think I came out of, say, the LSU preview a lot more confident in this team. In the LSU team, I don't think I changed my opinion too much of Notre Dame in previewing them. I still think they're an intriguing unknown at this point in the college basketball landscape.
Yeah, there was no real aha moment, when I was analyzing this team, but probably the closest thing to that is kind of this question of who is their second best player. So I would open it to you, Kevin. Who do you think is this team's second best player?
Wow, that's really tough. I'm not gonna bet on a freshman or Harvey just because of the health concerns and the youth concerns with the freshman. If you told me he would have been healthy all off season, I would have said DJ Harvey's the second best player on this team. But because he hasn't had that development, I'll say Rex Pfluger's like a 12.5 rebound, 3 assists, 3 and D type for them this season. Like, he defended pretty well last season. I think he's probably the best player on this team, which is a little scary, but also, I mean, he's not a bad player.
Yeah, I thought he would take a bigger jump last year. I mean, he did go from that 4.7 points a game as a sophomore to 8 points per game as a junior, but his shooting percentages really dropped with that bigger role. I'm not sure if on an NCAA tournament team to say that either Rex Pfluger, a injured or a DJ Harvey who's not 100%, or John Mooney is their second best player. I mean, that's very scary. But when you go to who's their seventh best player, and you're looking at guys like Prentice Hub and Nate Laszewski, I mean, then that's where the strength of this team lies. But in terms of making the NCAA tournament, it's that top end talent that's missing for this team.
Right, and Juwan Durham could be that. I'm not sure I would gamble on him being that. I don't think you would either. But talent-wise, he could be a top 3 player on an ACC team, no problem. On a good ACC team at that. I mean, 6'11", 215, super athletic and long, can impact the game on both ends of the floor. He's a guy who, we touched on him a little bit, but I think that the talent really can't be understated given the fact this is a guy who was a top 50 recruit, the fringe possibly top 25 recruit. Had every offer, and obviously the health has been a concern, and didn't show it at UConn, but the talent obviously there.
Yeah, my top 40 sit-out transfer list, I put Durham at number 40 as that first player on the list. Just you can't overlook him because of the talent, like you mentioned. But I mean, he showed nothing at UConn. He might not, or at UConn, he might not have been fully healthy. Probably was not fully healthy given his performance and just how he looked. So with that year off, I mean, if he's fully healthy, maybe I see him more as like a 5 or 6 point per game guy this year. Maybe as he gets up to his redshirt junior or a redshirt senior season, we can start to see major breakout season from him. But I think it would be wise to temper expectations of him this year.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right move. Anything else on Notre Dame before we move on to the second team we are going to preview today?
That's it for me.
All right, let's move on to George Mason. The Patriots went 16-17 last season, 9-9 in the A-10. That was good for fifth in the A-10, though it was in a deadlock with three other teams, 5 through 8 in that conference. VCU, St. Louis, and Richmond also at 9-9 in Atlantic 10 play. They, to my knowledge, did not play postseason basketball. Lost in the A-10 tournament to St. Joe's in a blowout, 68-49. But the exciting thing about this team is that everyone's back. The not exciting thing is this was a flawed team last year. And so how do we come to grips with that as in an A-10 that's clearly full of question marks for next season, I think would be the best way of putting it. How do we this somewhat known commodity, but also add some interesting pieces that will help this team? How do we negotiate ourselves into an A-10 standings for next season?
It's very interesting because you mentioned that they do bring everyone back, and they were 9-9 in the conference, but in terms of KenPom, they were 220th in KenPom, which put them as the second worst team in KenPom in the conference, only in front of Fordham. So with this unbalanced schedule, sometimes conference standing isn't a totally reliable way to judge how a team performed. But I think the most intriguing thing for me is they add Jared Reuter from Virginia. He was a former backup center here at Virginia, but he was a top 150 recruit. So I think at George Mason, he'll be able to kind of show more of his offensive abilities than at Virginia, where he's pretty much used as like a screener and as like a guy on like the offensive glass. I think he could really solidify this front court that was often playing guys out of position and playing a extremely small lineup with like Gunnar Marr at the 5. He's more of a 4, and then you can move a guy like Greg Calixte, who had to play a lot as a freshman last year, to like that backup center role. I think it adds a lot of balance, and it is the main reason for optimism for this team.
Yeah, and you touched on, just real quick, I wanted to go back. You touched on their KenPom ranking at 220, yet coming in 5th in the A-10. They were 5th in KenPom's luck metric, and they won on multiple buzzer beaters last season. There was a bit of magic with this team. They were very undersized. They had almost no depth, and they solved some of that problem with the recruiting and adding Reuter. Reuter, I'm excited to see what Reuter can do, because he's really an old school throwback type of player where he's not really a rim protector. He's kind of this undersized 5 who's very burly, but finishes well around the rim, and he's going to get a ton of one-on-ones in the post because George Mason has so many good guards who can spread you out, that they'll get a lot of 4-out-1-in looks where Reuter can catch the ball one-on-one in the post and use his physicality to get to the rim and score basketball. Bringing back in this backcourt, Otis Livingston is one of the best players in the A-10, averaged 17 points, 4.5 assists. Jair Grayer, who's kind of a combo wing, good rebounder, very strong, 12.7 rebounds. Justin Kier, 11 points, 4.5 rebounds, 2.5 assists. And then Goan Armar, who I'm extremely high on out of Minnesota, averaged 11 points and 4.5 rebounds as a freshman. He's a guy who I think is going to take the next step into a all A10 type player this season. They don't have a very big name recruiting class coming in. I think obviously the big name coming in is Reuter, but we should touch on them real quick. So I'll give you guys the rundown there with this George Mason incoming group. They have 3 commits for this class. They have Jordan Miller, who is a 6'3" guard out of nearby Purcellville, Virginia. Was one of these under-recruited guys who had offers from Towson, Radford, Drexel, High Point, and Campbell. Jason Douglas Stanley out of Mount Vernon is another 6'2", very shifty guard who had offers from Iona, Old Dominion, and Drexel. But he's an interesting prospect out of Mount Vernon in New York. And then Jamal Hartwell is another one of these smaller guards at 5'11" who is from LA. These are these smaller guards that Coach Paulson has really liked at George Mason. None of these guys to me look like instant impact guys, but they just do provide a little bit of extra depth. I mean, this team ran pretty much 7 deep last season, so just have extra bodies at the end of the bench who can play 8-10 minutes would be a big lift.
Yeah, so Miller, I was watching some highlights just to kind of familiarize myself with him, and I'm watching like this guy's not 6'3", but he on a 24/7 they had him at 6'3". On the George Mason roster, they have him at 6'6", which makes a lot more sense. He really looks like a prototypical kind of combo forward. And Jason Douglas Stanley is more of a catch and shoot, kind of like a shooter type of undersized 2 guard, and then Hartwell is like a scoring guard. I agree. None of those 3 are really gonna. Well, I shouldn't say that, but I don't think any of those 3 are gonna play a huge role this season, just because they bring back their 8 rotation guys who all played, I think, at least 17 minutes a game, and they add Jared Reuter, like we mentioned. That's a pretty logical top 9 right there. The thing that scares me the most about George Mason, we mentioned that they were 220th in KenPom with a down A10. I think the A10 is actually going to be a lot better, especially in that middle and in the bottom next season. But they were also very injury-free, which I'm sure contributed to their luck rating. A.J. Wilson, who was like their 8th man, he missed 2 games, and Jair Greer missed 1. And I don't know if that was injury-related or suspension or whatever, or just a DMP. But to be that injury-free, to still be that bad, and then to expect them to make this huge jump to like a bubble team, which would be going from like 220 to like 50, that's an enormous jump. Similar to one I think a lot of people thought UNLV would have last year, and they weren't able to make that jump despite adding a lot of talent. I know a lot of people kind of say that about St. John's, like, oh, how are they going to go from like 77 to like the top 25? But going from 220 to like 50 is an enormous jump.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. And I think for me, a lot of it is this team was so flawed last season by just not having a front court. Their front court last season was Goan Armar, who is a very skinny 6'7" kid, who is really more of like a combo 3-4, like a stretch 4 really is his probably natural spot in college basketball. A freshman in Greg Calixte, who gave them some okay minutes as a freshman, but he was not ready to play A10 basketball, and certainly not ready to be a 20-minute-a-game player, which is what he had to be. They also had A.J. Wilson, who's just like very undersized, big guy who just out of the gym, and so he provided a little bit of rim protection, and so just adding Reuter just makes their offense just go so much more smoothly. And to injury point, I will say both Greyer and Kier were both beat up last season, and I noticed Livingston was run into the ground playing 37 minutes a game. Guys were beat up throughout the season. They just played because they had no other option. And I think obviously severe injuries can happen, but these guys will play better and more efficient basketball, I think is one of the arguments that a George Mason fan will make, given that they have just depth behind them and they don't have to play every minute and they don't have to be relied on to do as much rebounding and guarding bigger players. Jair Grayer is 6'4" and physical, and he guarded a lot of fours last season. And now they'll have Reuter and they can switch more onto fours. That'll just give them a lot more flexibility. That'll give Grayer a lot less stress on the defensive end, give him a lot more energy on the offensive end. So I think those are some of the small things that you don't really think about that could improve this team just by Jared Reuter's presence beyond he's actually a very good A10 player.
Yeah, I agree 100% because when I was going into the research, I had George Mason as my second team in the Atlantic 10. Then I start and I get a little worried, looking at some of these KenPom numbers. But then the more I dove, then I kind of went back to where I was before and was high on them again. Mostly because of the synergies that Jared Reuter creates in this lineup. You mentioned a lot with the roles that Mar and Grayer and everyone were forced to play. I mean, they have a nice four-man front court now with Mar, Reuter, Kaliks, and Wilson, who can all play together. They can all mix and match. Maybe not Reuter and Greg Kaliks, but for the most part, you have a lot of options there. The depth is much improved. They're only 337th in bench minutes last season, and Reuter will fill that void. Therefore, pushing some guys like an Ian Boyd or Kaliks, who got some starting minutes last year, to be a very very experienced, very proven reserve that maybe a lot of teams in the Atlantic 10 don't have. And then another thing to really focus on is they were 339th in experience according to KenPom last year, with an average experience of under 1 year. So just not only having these guys playing together for another year, but guys who were very inexperienced in Division I college basketball, completely running it back and adding a legitimately talented transfer. I think there is a lot of reason for optimism, despite some of these concerning numbers based on their roster last season.
There's so many quirky stats about this George Mason team. That was the biggest thing I came away in my prep for this. This George Mason team won the rebounding battle last season, which would seem shocking given how small they were, what a lack of depth they were. They actually in A10 play, they won the rebounding battle slightly, and then they also won the rebounding battle overall for the season. And this team was very low in assists, which makes very little sense when you have lots of guards who can score the basketball. So I think they definitely need to improve on the ball movement side. They also had the best free throw defense in the Atlantic 10, which is always an interesting statistic to kind of, I don't know if it's really important or not, but I mean, I guess teams shooting badly from the free throw line against you, it certainly matters statistically in a game and certainly factors into their luck. Next season, does everyone start hitting 75% from the line against them, and that costs them points every game? I mean, we'll see. They were pretty bad defensively, though, and I think Reuter helps with that just by matching up better in man-to-man. So I think that'll be a benefit, as well as just being able to foul and not worry about not having enough players to play the game. That's always big. So the thing I've been trying to do with this George Mason team as I project them is look at everything that they did poorly last year and see how Jared Reuter's addition, because pretty much he's the only impact newcomer, changes that, and how much can they improve it just by running it back, and then how much is actually just a flaw of this team that won't improve. I think they need to move the ball. I think that's the first thing. They have to shoot the ball a little bit better. They shot the ball pretty well in A10 play, 36% from three, but only 32.5% in all for the rest of the season. Non-conference, they really shot the ball poorly. So I'm really just kind of it's really hard for me to grapple with this team. It's an A10 full of unknowns, and they're a known commodity. But how good is that known commodity, and how much better can the A10 teams be to knock them off?
Yeah, that's one of the main things that's kind of on the con side of George Mason is that the A10 is going to be a lot stronger than it was last year. I mean, just like if you look at some of these teams like St. Louis, like they were not very good last year. They've totally revamped their roster and will probably be at the top of the conference. If Marcus Evans is healthy for a VCU, they should be another quality team. URI and St. Bonaventure lose a lot, and so does Davidson, but like they aren't totally like devoid of talent. Like they'll be able to compete in the conference. So whereas in terms of KenPom, where most of these teams kind of fell between like 140 and 190 last year, I think this year the shift's going to be between like 70 and 110. So I think like the overall just like quality of of the league from a top from top to bottom is so much better that even if George Mason makes a significant jump, it may be mitigated or like they may not be able to establish themselves as like this clear top tier team like URI, Bonnies, and Davidson were last year, just because the rest of the pack is also moving in that direction as well.
Right, and I think the biggest thing with the A10 this year is there's a lot of good teams and there's no great teams. Like,
Yeah.
a lot of times why I'm considering them they're a one-bid league right now, because right now I can't see a team that I'm like, that's an at-large team. The only team that I think has clearly like at-large level talent is St. Louis, and they have a bad game coach and a roster that doesn't necessarily fit well together. VCU is going to be pretty solid. And Marcus Evans is very good. Kellen Grady's excellent at Davidson. St. Bonnie's loses a lot. Rhode Island has some young talent, but they're not going to be an at-large competitor. George Mason, to me, isn't an at-large type team. Richmond lost 20 games last season and lost key pieces. Dayton brings in some pieces, but they're still far away from an at-large spot for me. UMass, I like them a lot. They're not an at-large team. Like, I go up and down this list and I say there's no at-large teams. I think there's going to be a lot of beating each other up in this A10. I think 13-5 will win you the A10 this year, or at least get you a share of the A10 title.
I agree, but I think the fact that they are beating themselves up, it's not like last year where there were literally 11 minefields in a 14-team conference. There were 11. So there were 3 teams ranked between 43 and 68, and that was URI, Bonnies, and Davidson. And these are all KenPom members, so they're not. I mean, this is just like an estimation of like where they stood in like the national picture. The 4th best team was St. Joe's at 116, and most of these teams, I mean, most of these teams are in that kind of latter half of the 100s, and if all these teams kind of move into the front half of the 100s, like the high double digits, like being like in the 80s or 90s, those games will be worth more to the selection committee, especially the road games. Maybe even some of these games become quadrant 1 games, and most will definitely be quadrant 2 on the road. So the beating each other up won't have as big of an impact. Kind of similar to like the Big East usually, where the Big East can beat each other up and still be at large. And still have 6 or 7 teams that are 10-8 or 9-9 and qualify to be an at large. Whereas the A10, I think the beating each other up in the middle will give them a lot of NIT teams. So just not the same level, but I don't think that beating each other up will be as damaging as it was last season, where there were just pitfall after pitfall.
Right. I think that's pretty fair. I question how much the committee will truly value a quadrant 2 win of, oh wow, you beat George Mason on the road. Like to me, like I don't know how this league assembles at large bids. And I don't think any of these teams are good enough where they'll make a huge dent in the non-conference. I saw George Mason, one of the reporters who covers George Mason, I believe it was Tyler Byram. Let me try to pull up the tweet real quick. Yeah, Tyler Byram. He tweeted out this morning like a schedule update. They have Georgia Southern at home, NC Central at home, at Kansas State, at Georgia Southern. So they have like a home and home with Georgia Southern. and then they have at William and Mary, and then they have Cincinnati. They have either Ole Miss or Baylor. Those two games were the Emerald Coast Classic, and then they have reportedly American, Wagner, and Navy. They have really no at-large chance unless they steal 2 of 3 of Kansas State, Cincinnati, and Ole Miss / Baylor, and I don't really see them doing that. So, like, this is one of the teams that we project as a premier A10 team. They're not going to come close to an at-large bid in my estimation. I see them more like a 75 10-bomb team this year, where they're like competitive and will be like a 12 or a 13 seed if they make the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I have them right around the cut line. It's a very aggressive ranking, but there's just so many teams in like that kind of bubble to NIT tier in the A10. They're not really bubble teams, but like if you could make an argument for them to be a bubble team, but they're more likely an NIT team. A lot of it's going to come down, like in terms of the A10 and like the number of bids. I mean, you look at last season where Davidson was not going to get an at-large, and they were the third best team. They were in the top 50 in KenPom just because they didn't have the opportunities with 11 teams in that conference being pretty bad. But like if things break another way, like if St. Bonaventure loses that game against URI, maybe they're not in the NCAA tournament. They were in the play-in round. So the A10 was a couple bounces away from being a one-bid league. So that could work in its favor or against its favor next year, where it's unquestionably a stronger league, but a couple bounces, maybe they get 3 or 4 bids, or maybe even though they're a stronger league, they only get 1.
Well, and it's funny because every time I say they're going to be a one-bid league, I get like 12 replies from A10 fans in my Twitter mentions complaining, and they never say, oh, well, these 2 teams or these 3 teams should be at large level. They just say, the A10 always gets multiple bids. We had 3 last year. How are we only going down to 1? And I just don't comprehend. Like, show me an argument where there's, like, what team is definitively an at-large caliber team? Like, George Mason might be. UMass, if everything breaks right, might be. St. Louis, if everything breaks right, might be. VCU has talent. I don't see it. Like, at what point do we just does it just become such a challenge to project more than 1 bid for this league? And now that could change. But I'm not just going to give them multiple bids just to say that because they always get them, that they'll get them this year. Like, I just don't see NCAA tournament teams in this league right now.
Yeah, I think it just comes down to if you're trying to do like a projected bracket of like who you think will be in the field, then it's not as ridiculous to say, the A10 will, like a second team could emerge. But if you're trying to just rank the teams based on their, based on how good you think that they will be nationally, I don't think any of these A10 teams break the top 45. Like St. Louis is the closest, but I mean, who? You really have to compare these teams to like the other bubble teams. So like who do you like? Would you rather have St. Louis or like Miami or Arizona or Houston?
Or let's even simplify it. We just talked about Notre Dame. I don't think there's a team in the A10 I wouldn't take Notre Dame almost definitively over right now. If you said give me a roster, give me a roster including their coach. I think I would take Notre Dame over St. Louis. St. Louis is the only roster to me that warrants that consideration, but I just don't trust Travis Ford to put those pieces together in a way, especially given they have such flaws shooting basketball.
I think I would definitely take St. Louis over Notre Dame, and maybe even George Mason, who's my second team. Maybe I'm being way too aggressive on Mason, but I mean we mentioned in that first half hour. I mean there are significant kind of flaws in that Notre Dame team, and to project them as a tournament team, you really need to buy in a couple of these guys making huge jumps. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility at all that a more experienced and more cohesive George Mason team in a weaker conference is able to surpass Notre Dame.
Yeah, I think that's like a reasonable take. Um, let's kind of wrap up George Mason. Where do we see this team in the Atlantic 10 this year, and where do we see them
Yeah, so
nationally? I touched on this a lot.
I have them second in the A10 and about in that 50 to 55 range nationally.
So I tweeted out on June 30th rankings that had George Mason number one. I must be honest, now that I think about it, the more I'm very hesitant, looking at this team, of them as a number one type team in this conference, more in that kind of 3 to 5, 3 to 6 range. Our problem is I just don't have the team at number one other than maybe St. Louis, and I don't feel great about them either. Um, I think for now I'll say 3 to 5 range in the A10 is where where I'm comfortable picking George Mason, and in that 75 to 80 range nationally. But certainly the upside is there for them to sneak into that fringe top 50, even top 40, and win the A10. This league is just kind of it's very blah to me. Like there's so many like intriguing but not there yet teams that it's hard for me to really get excited about this league in the way that you seem to be.
Yeah, I'm very excited about the parity of the league overall. Some of these teams like UMass, the more I look, kind of the more I don't like. But then a team like maybe St. Joe's or maybe URI, the more that I kind of analyze them, the more I kind of like them. Same with Bonaventure too. Now I don't think any of those teams are close to the NCAA tournament, but I think all three could be a nice NIT caliber club. In terms of identifying a breakout team and why George Mason could, fit that profile. They return a lot, but they also add a very impactful player. So it's not like a team like Seton Hall last year, where they're just completely running it back and they don't make like a major jump. They are adding a very talented piece in Jared Reuter. And while this is a more experienced and now a more veteran team, it's not just all juniors and seniors. I mean, guys like Gunnar Marr could certainly make a big jump as a sophomore. And then they have a pretty well respected coach. There is room to move up the standings in the conference. There is a potential for that, unlike some of these high major leagues where where like a team like DePaul can improve their team so much, but they just can't climb the standings. So I think all of these factors, and having a very talented lead guard in Otis Livingston, all these factors kind of lead me to believe that George Mason could be a breakout team nationally.
Yeah, I think it's all really just about it. It comes down to really what we started with on this team, and that's how much does Jared Reuter fundamentally change how this team looks in terms of if Jared Reuter makes everyone better on this team, your prediction of win the A10 top 50 team feels pretty fair and pretty reasonable. I'm not totally there that happens, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did. And let's remember, Jared Reuter averaged 4 points and 2 rebounds in 10 minutes a game at Virginia. I mean, even if you just per 30 that, you're talking about a guy in the 12.6 6.5 rebound, 6-7 rebound a guy in the ACC. Now, if you per 30 that in the A10, I mean, you're talking about a high impact player. And now how much does his impact change George Mason? We'll see how that offense really develops. I will say the best big that Coach Paulson has ever coached is Mike Muscala, who was a bit more of a stretch big, although in college he did play back to the basket a bit more. So I'm really intrigued to see how does it all fit together into one kind of puzzle, into one winning team at George Mason this season.
Absolutely, and I think that'll wrap up our George Mason discussion. One of the more interesting teams. The more that we do research on these teams, the more I just want this season to come. I probably have about 1 or 2 more months left in me before I get really antsy for college basketball to start up again.
Yeah, the other day I was like sitting at home and I was thinking about all like the trips to games I could try to make this season. I was thinking about like once I'm home from school, doing like a 7 games in 2 days trip to Atlantic City and Mohegan Sun for like a quadruple header and a triple header in December. I was thinking about, well, how many Loyola games should I go to? I'll be at all the Northwestern games. How many will I cover? You know, this and that, and all these games I'm trying to get to, and what will I have? What? And I was like, teams haven't even released schedules. This sucks. We're still 4 months away. So it's always good to kind of chop it up here and break down what we've got. And I think in those 2 months, we'll begin to getting close to practice really getting underway. And international trip info should be coming out soon enough for us to start making hot takes about that, Brad. So the wait will be over before we know. We're over halfway there.
Yeah, so I think if it starts November 6th, we have 3 months and 2 weeks.
Pretty much, yeah. That's pretty hard to swallow, but pretty exciting nonetheless. And I believe that will wrap us up for the podcast today. Thanks always for listening. Always hit us up on Twitter, hit us up in the comments if you have teams you want us to discuss. We may not have a deep dive next week just because we're hoping to get that special guest, which we will share with you as soon as we can. Hopefully early next week. Recruiting does put a wrench in those plans, but we're hoping to get him on as soon as we can. And it'll be an exciting time for the CBB Central podcast. And keep listening. Thanks as always, and have a great day.